Hello, I'm Michael Shawn, and welcome to Roger Dykes Just Sayin. Roger Dykes is a teacher and counselor with a master's degree in family counseling from Texas Tech University. He is the owner of UV Blake Records and has written a book titled Non-Persons Rolling in a Normal World. And there's a few more things. Roger was born with cerebral palsy. Now a quadriplegic, he has been confined most of his life to a wheelchair. And for a while, even enjoying a career as a stand-up or sit-down comedian and after-dinner speaker. Disabled? Yes, but you forget about that pretty quickly because Roger thrives. So here is Roger Dykes.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. And by the way, Michael's here again today with us. Michael, we're glad you could drop in.
Well, I was noticing there's no donuts or cookies or coffee or anything here. I need to bring kind of a picnic sack lunch when we do these things.
Sounds good to me. I would enjoy anything you want to bring, I'm sure.
Roger, it's always good to be hanging out with you. And I've been thinking about this podcast a lot the last few days. And there's some stuff we need to bring up and talk about. But what's on your mind this morning?
Oh, I'm just happy to be here and glad that we can get together and discuss some things of some importance and some things maybe not so important, but maybe they'll just be fun.
Let's give an example of our position here. I'm a good example in that I have known you for decades, but it wasn't until I read your book lately. And when I was reading your book, it was just an enjoyable read. It was fun because of my buddy Roger. Then as chapter after chapter, as I got over in it, I began to understand you in a way I had not picked up on before. And that's saying something because I had known you for years. Suddenly I began to realize that your world, obviously different when you physically look at you, the fact that you are a quadriplegic and you are in a wheelchair and deal with that every day, you think, well, sure, I understand. But I didn't understand anything. Your day-to-day concerns are a lot more than most people would think. Isn't that true?
Oh, that's exactly right. And a lot of people I know I have public outings and things like that. And I've often thought people have no idea what all went in to getting me in a position that they're now listening to me entertain, listening to me talk, teach, or whatever. They just assume I just appear out of thin air and arrive and dressed and poised or whatever as I am. If they were only here of a morning to see what all went in to getting me ready for that, I think they would be surprised.
Okay. Now, I'm going to be blunt right here, Roger. Why should people care about that? Particularly if they don't know you. You're pretty easy to care about if someone would meet you and get to know you. There's a guy there with a great sense of humor and smarter. The more I know you, the more I realize your master's degree and all that sort of thing. It's all in there. Yet, why should people concern themselves with, Roger's got to go the extra mile to show up for a church service or a public gathering of any type? Talk to me about that a little bit.
Well, I think when you understand a little bit more about the world of the disabled, whatever your disability may be, you will quickly come to realize that there is more challenge than the obvious. People would, I suppose, would look at me and say, well, it's a shame that he has to be pushed from place to place and he doesn't have mobility. And I'm not sure it's a shame, but nonetheless, that is a reality. The difference, though, is that there's so many more aspects to my disability that affect so many other parts of my life that they do not see that. They just assume. People assume, generally speaking, that we all do the same thing the same way. So every aspect of my world has been affected by the disability. And you learn to adjust, you learn to cope, you learn to figure out other ways of getting things done that normal people don't have to even think about because they just get up and do things. And I get up and things are done, but most of it takes a lot of preparation and discussion and talk. Once you get the routine down, of course, it gets a whole lot easier. But there's a basic routine that goes into every aspect of everything I do. How my food is prepared, and I don't mean cooked, I mean cut up, given the right utensils, and that's going to vary now, individual to individual, and which is true of all disabilities. And of course, you can ignore that reality and say, well, that's his problem, that's their problem. But as we've talked before, Michael, most people are one step away from twisting their ankle, breaking their leg, whatever, and you may not be in a permanent disability situation, but it's quite easy in the world in which we live to find yourself temporarily disabled. And a temporary disability will make you aware of many things that you're not aware of now.
The width of the typical bathroom door in most American homes doesn't allow a wheelchair to come in.
That is true. So when you go to Colorado and you do something which I consider to be asinine stupid, and that is put your feet on two narrow boards and fly down the side of a mountain for no reason at all. These are people that do not appreciate the ability to walk. But when they get to the bottom and they break their leg and they get it set and they come home and are in a wheelchair for a period of time, all of a sudden everything that I will mention or talk about comes home and they go, oh, now I know what he's talking about.
Roger, you have a book, and the purpose of this podcast is not to sell books, as is true with many podcasts, but you do have a book that you began writing in the 1970s. And the reason why I point that out, the name of your book is Non-Persons Rolling in a Normal World. And even the title itself, it needs some explanation. The fact that non-persons, and there is a segment in your book that talks about you and a young lady spending the day or spending the afternoon, and you go several places, and during that time there's a couple of different meals out, and the way you are treated as a non-person, and yet it's not anything that we think, well, you know, we were being intentionally rude or that sort of thing. In fact, you have a caregiver by the name of Beth who has been with you a long time, and we all like Beth. We think a lot of her. And yet I was at your home one day not long ago, and Beth and I began having a conversation in front of you like you weren't there. Like we were talking about you, and suddenly our conversation was with each other, but we were talking about you, but it was like you weren't there. Suddenly, Roger was over in the corner sitting in his wheelchair. He was a non-person. And I got about 3 sentences into that with Beth, and I had just gotten through spending time reading in your book. And I said, holy smoke, Beth, we just did it. I mean, I thought I was aware of this, and I just did it. And you're just sitting there grinning like, yeah, you did.
Well, and what you have to understand is if friends who are aware of me and are friends of mine, been around for a long, long time, they can have this happen to them. You can well imagine how the rest of society does. And the reason I mention that, let me give you an example, and this happened numerous times. I will go into restaurants. The waiter or the waitress will come over, and first of all, I've literally had them ask the person with me, does he need a menu? Of course, what they're implying is, what the implication is, would he know what to do with it if he had it? And one of my friends answered the waitress this way. She said, well, yes, you can let him have it because he likes to look at the pictures. The problem, Michael, is that but many people equate disability with mentally challenged.
Yeah.
And there is some basis for that. I mean, there are people who are physically disabled who are mentally challenged. That's true. But there are many, many people who are physically disabled who have no problem in understanding, speaking, reading, and all those kinds of things. The implication is, though, that all people in wheelchairs are mentally challenged. Not true. And they do not, many people do not know what to do. They don't want to, in other words, they don't want to start talking to me, find out all I can do is stutter and dribble. And then they're embarrassed because they brought it up and they don't know what to do. I have found that the best advice is to simply treat that person who is disabled as though they have all their abilities and faculties like anyone else. And if they don't, normally, I have never seen it happen that person doesn't have a caregiver or a person around that can fill in the blanks and take care of it.
Yeah. What you just described is not even just going to restaurants. It is like in almost every facet of your world. You can be somewhere like the mall, for instance, and dealing with clerks behind a counter. And if there is another, let's say, for the sake of this conversation, normal person with you, then the conversation will immediately exclude you completely. When in fact, you're the reason why they're there. You're the person making the buying decision, and you're the person deciding whether or not you're going to do business in this place. It happens all the time.
Well, it happens a great deal of the time. In fact, I was in one store, this has been several years ago now, but I was in one store. And we were in there, and I was talking to the clerk behind the counter about buying a particular item, and I had a caregiver with me, and so we got through the transaction, and we got outside. My caregiver said, "I am so angry," and I said, "What are you angry about?" And she said, "Because that clerk did not acknowledge you through the whole conversation. You asked questions, and he never took his eyes off me answering your questions." Mm-hmm. And I said, well, you're right. I agreed with her because that was true. But I said, now, let's give him benefit of the doubt. And she said, okay. And I said, well, he probably thought that it was a ventriloquist act, and there was no point talking to the dummy in the wheelchair.
Oh, Roger. You know, what we're talking about here is one of the things, and there are several purposes here, but one of the things is to raise some awareness about what a disabled person can often deal with from time to time and from day to day. And where this gets tricky is when you are trying to take care of a situation. For instance, I'm trying to think, perhaps you've had a device that you're taking back because it doesn't work properly, and you either want it exchanged or something like that, and it almost becomes impossible for you to communicate because they don't look at you as an actual person. And I guess that's the bottom line here.
Well, that's true. And the thing you have to do, though, I choose to not get upset. I choose to accept it as part of the reality. I'd like for it to change over time. I think it is getting better. It does get better, but the thing about my attitude, or I try to have the attitude, of never becoming angry about it. I would rather have fun with it. then get angry. I've written material. I've done jokes. Most of the material that I've written that it had to do with my comedic experiences were true stories that were elaborated and, of course, exaggerated for the sense of getting comedy out of them. But they were based in actual facts of things that have happened to me. But I can choose. I learned a long time ago that to get angry, I've known handicapped people and disabled people who got angry every time something happened that wasn't right.
Yeah.
And but the problem with that is they stay angry all the time. So I would choose not to become angry. And this is what I have tried to present in all my appearances, everything I've said, written, and done, is we need, as disabled people, we've got to change the way people see us and think about us in a more positive way. But we're going to do that not by becoming angry and protesting and doing all these things. Rather, we'll have a much better shot at doing that with a more of a positive public relations campaign.
Doesn't it kind of miff you that here you are saying, hey, we need to change perception on some things? And man, it's not just what we're talking about here. It is the way the state of Texas, for instance, the way they perceive you and so on. And there's all kinds of stuff we could begin talking about. But isn't it twice, 3 times, 10 times as hard to change the perception of the public around you when no one is looking at you as a normal person anyway?
Absolutely, because if you don't register in people's consciousness, then there's no reason for them to consider changing anything for your benefit because you don't exist. Now, please understand, do not hear me say that to the extent that I don't exist. And there are many, many people who would say, oh, I know Roger, and yeah. What I'm talking about in the sense of knowing me and understanding my world is that they know me, they do not understand the world because they've never experienced the world. So as we can present material on this podcast, and as I've done throughout my career, is to bring up issues and point them out in such a way that people can relate to them and hopefully make positive changes for the handicapped people of this society.
For the listeners of this podcast, I just want to point out that you don't maybe fully understand or not aware of how unusual, just take cerebral palsy for an example here, how unusual to hear the inside story, what's inside the mind of someone who has dealt with cerebral palsy their entire life, because most cerebral palsy people like that are dealing with that, most of them do not speak clearly enough. After a few years, they really do shut themselves inside. If the truth were known, inside there where the brain and the spirit all live, there is a normal person there that just gets exhausted trying to communicate with the world around them. Roger, your situation is you speak more clearly, but that's very unusual, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I have been blessed because I've always been able to speak. My mother told me that I started talking almost the day I was born, but and never stopped for that matter. But the fact of the matter is that I have been blessed with ability to speak clearly enough to be understood, which the doctors have never understood. Cerebral palsy is brain damage. I mean, most people probably know that, but that's what causes cerebral palsy. Well, the part of my brain that is affected, which include my arms, legs, and so forth, should have affected my speech. And the doctors are baffled as to why it didn't affect my speech. Many people in bygone days, more so than now perhaps, were considered mentally challenged because they had no way of communicating what they knew. So when they couldn't speak clearly or they couldn't speak at all,
Oh, what a shame. Yeah.
They were considered, written off as mentally challenged. Now, fortunately, in today's world, this has been because of technology. It now is possible for people who cannot speak clearly or cannot speak at all to use equipment to get their message through. And what they have found is many of the people that they thought were mentally challenged weren't. But of course, if you're considered as a child mentally challenged and treated that way, you will not have access to educational processes that will prove that you are smarter than you appear to be.
I'd like to point something out right here. I have a distinct advantage over a lot of the listeners in this podcast in that I have interacted with Roger closely long enough, and I am aware of a lot of the things that we'll be able to talk about on this podcast, so that I know so many things about Roger's life are just fascinating. And there's only so much time in each one of our podcasts. I am so looking forward. I'm taking mental notes as we speak here, Roger. I am so looking forward. There's just so much time in each one of our podcasts. Man, Roger, so that people will understand, we are at this point deep in the clutches of the coronavirus thing, which will be, I think, legendary in days, weeks, months, and years to come. And we'll all point back to this time. But Roger is in his home office. We have connected Roger with our studio here, and we have a chance to visit much more clearly than like if we were using the telephone. Thank you for letting me spend the time to say that, Roger. The name of Roger's book, Non-Persons Rolling in a Normal World, and it is available on Amazon in audio form. And in the weeks and months to come, we'll say your podcast is going to renew every 3 weeks. So we would ask you to subscribe to Roger's podcast because there's lots of stuff that needs to be talked about. Roger, for you to just go, say, to church on Sunday morning and then maybe out to lunch afterwards, what all has to be in place for you to do that?
Well, it starts with someone being here around 6 o'clock in the morning to get me up, get clothing on, appropriate clothing, because it's different for Sunday morning than normal. There's also the fact of the normal things of shaving and so forth. And I need help with most of that, or I cannot do it totally independent. So that needs to be done. And then for me to get to church, and let's say I'm dressed, okay, I'm ready to go now. I can't go to church unless somebody comes by and picks me up. So that requires someone coming. Now, I have a van with a lift, so they can put me in the van and drive me to the church building. We get to the church building, though, and someone has to push me wherever we need to go, from classrooms to auditoriums to wherever the services are being held. And so that's been done. I need people for that. That has to be done. Then of course, we go through the service. I need some help during the service. I don't hold songbooks very well or anything else. But we get through that, and then we come home. Somebody has to drive me back home. They don't want to leave me in the building. Nobody wants me there all week. So we come home, and then someone comes by, picks me up, back in the same van again. We go to the restaurant. We get to the restaurant. Well, when you get to a restaurant and you start to roll up under the table, if the legs of the table are perpendicular with the table, meaning you roll straight into it, I can do that great.
In other words, there is a limited amount of places that you fit.
When we go in and look in a restaurant, we don't look at the tabletop, whether I can get to it or not. We get up to it, then food's ordered, food's delivered. The person with me needs to cut up the food It's delivered, I eat it, and they bring me home.
And then there's the whole back and forth with the waiter or waitress paying attention to the person that's with you and not you. Does he want something to drink?
Right. Does he need a menu? And all those kind of questions. So that goes on as well. But that's just that's how many people it takes to get me just on something simple, like most people would get up and go and do and not even think about it.
And so the well-meaning acquaintance comes up behind you where you're sitting in the aisle at a church service, say, for instance, and slaps you on the back and go, "So, how's it going, Roger?" And it's just a lot simpler to look up and grin and say, "Just fine. How are you?"
Right. But also,
they have no idea.
Also, remember, if they slap me on the back too hard, the floor is sloped in most auditoriums, and I will be sitting at the front of the building very quickly.
Okay. Well, so much for social distancing. Roger, we're out of time. The book, again, is Non-Persons in a Rolling World on Amazon, or I think maybe Kindle too. But Roger Dykes, all the best.
Well, thanks for coming by, Michael, and thanks you, everyone, for listening to the podcast. And I hope to see you again in about 3 weeks.
Adios, brother.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Roger Dykes Just Sayin. If you'd like to get a message to Roger, his Facebook account is listed as Roger Dykes. Become a friend, or you can send your questions and comments to rogerdykes51@gmail.com. That's ROGERDYKES51@gmail.com. Our podcast reveals a new episode every 3 weeks. Rollout is on Wednesday evening, shortly after dark, Texas time. Join us next time for our next episode of Roger Dykes Just Sayin. I'm Michael Shawn. On behalf of Roger Dykes, thanks for listening.